In the dusty heart of Texas, where the wind carries more stories than the local newspaper, Luke Maddox had spent 34 years believing he was meant to walk through life alone. The son of a man who thought affection was weakness and raised by circumstances that taught him trust was dangerous, Luke knew how to break a wild horse, mend a broken fence, and work until his hands bled. But he'd never known the simple comfort of human touch. Then Maisie Quinn returned to Millfield with her gentle smile and determined spirit, ready to save her mother's crumbling horse sanctuary. She saw something in Luke that others missed, not the rough exterior or the walls he'd built, but the lonely heart beneath. When she wrapped her arms around him in gratitude for fixing her barn door, something shifted in Luke's carefully guarded world. But would one moment of tenderness be enough to heal a lifetime of wounds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Maddox property as Luke walked the fence line that had defined his world for the better part of 2 decades. His boots crunched against the frost-touched grass, each step a meditation in solitude that had become as natural as breathing. The ritual never changed. Wake before dawn, check the horses, mend what needed mending, and speak to no one unless absolutely necessary. Luke's hands, scarred from years of honest work, ran along the wooden posts with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that everything eventually breaks down if you don't tend to it. His father's voice still echoed in his memory sometimes, harsh and unforgiving. "A man stands on his own 2 feet, boy. Anything else is just weakness waiting to knock you down." The Maddox ranch wasn't much to look at. 50 acres of stubborn Texas soil that produced enough hay to keep his small herd of cattle fed and provide a modest living. Luke had inherited the land along with his father's debts and his mother's few precious memories, kept locked away in a coffee tin beneath his bed. The tin held a wedding ring, a faded photograph, and the last letter his mother had written before. Cancer took her when Luke was 12. He hadn't opened that tin in 5 years. Millfield stretched out below his property, a town of 800 souls who all seemed to know each other's business better than their own. From his vantage point on the hill, Luke could see the water tower with its peeling paint, the main street lined with businesses that had weathered decades of economic uncertainty, and the network of dirt roads that connected neighbor to neighbor in ways that Luke had never quite understood. Community was a foreign concept to a man raised in isolation. The town had its rhythms, and Luke had learned to move around them rather than through them. He knew that Mrs. Henderson at the general store would nod politely when he came for supplies, that Sheriff Tom Bradley would tip his hat with the kind of careful respect reserved for men who paid their taxes and caused no trouble, and that the younger folks would whisper about that Maddox boy with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that follows a reputation for keeping to yourself. Luke had been 17 when his father died in a tractor accident, leaving him with land, livestock, and a legacy of silence that ran deeper than the well behind the house. The funeral had been sparsely attended. His father hadn't been a man who inspired affection, but Luke remembered standing by the graveside and feeling nothing but relief that the shouting was finally over. The preacher had spoken about forgiveness and eternal rest, but Luke had just wanted to get home to check on the horses. That was 17 years ago, and in all that time, Luke had built a life that required nothing from anyone. He fixed his own equipment, grew his own food, and conducted his business with handshakes and cash transactions that left no room for lingering conversations. The system worked because it was simple, predictable, and safe. The sound of a truck, engine struggling against gravity, broke through his morning thoughts. Luke looked toward the main road and saw a beat-up pickup truck with a horse trailer attached, smoke trailing from its exhaust as it labored up the hill toward the old Quinn place. The Quinn Horse Sanctuary had been empty for 3 years now, ever since Eleanor Quinn had passed away and left the property in some kind of legal limbo. that the town folks whispered about but never quite explained. Luke watched the truck disappear around the bend, then continued his fence inspection. Other people's business was exactly that, other people's business. He had learned that lesson the hard way as a child, when curiosity about the neighbors had earned him a belt across the back and a lecture about minding his own affairs. On time, Luke finished his morning routine and headed back to the house for breakfast. The sun had burned off the morning chill and settled into the kind of steady warmth that promised a good day for outside work. He was pouring coffee from the pot he'd made strong enough to strip paint when he heard the sound of someone walking up his driveway. Through the kitchen window, Luke could see a woman approaching the house. She was slight, but moved with purpose. Her dark brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had already begun to escape the morning's careful arrangement. She wore jeans that had seen honest work and boots that had earned their scuff marks, but there was something about the way she carried herself that spoke of determination tempered by uncertainty. Luke set down his coffee mug and stepped onto the front porch, his natural wariness kicking in like a reflex. Visitors were rare, and unexpected visitors were usually trouble of one kind or another. "Morning," the woman called out when she spotted him. Her voice carried the hint of an accent that suggested she'd spent time beyond Texas borders. But there was something familiar about her tone that Luke couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry to bother you so early. I'm Maisie Quinn." The name clicked into place with the force of a cattle gate swinging shut. Quinn. Eleanor Quinn's daughter, the one who had left Millfield after high school and never looked back. Luke had vague memories of a quiet girl who had sometimes ridden her bike past his property, but that had been more than 15 years ago. "I'm Luke Maddox," he said, keeping his distance on the porch. "This is the Maddox place." "I know," Maisie said, and Luke caught something in her expression that might have been a smile. "I remember you from school, though I was a few years behind." I was wondering if I could ask you about my mother's truck." Luke's eyebrows drew together. "Don't know anything about your mother's truck. It's broken down about a quarter-mile up the road from here," Maisie explained. "Engine just died on me, and I was hoping maybe you might know someone who could take a look at it. I'm kind of stuck until I can get it running again." The request was simple enough, but Luke found himself studying Maisie Quinn's face for signs of the complications that usually came with helping neighbors. She looked tired, he realized, with the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens that were too heavy for one person. Her clothes were clean but worn, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. "Tommy Martinez runs the garage in town," Luke said finally. "He's honest and his prices are fair." "I called him already," Maisie said. "He's backed up for 3 days, and I really need to get moved in sooner than that. I was wondering if maybe you might know enough about engines to take a quick look. I can pay you for your time." Luke felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone asked him to step outside his carefully constructed boundaries. Helping neighbors led to conversations, conversations led to expectations, and expectations led to disappointments. It was simpler to keep his distance, but something about the way Maisie Quinn stood there, hopeful but not demanding, tired but not defeated, made him hesitate before delivering his usual polite refusal. "What kind of truck?" he heard himself asking. 1995 Ford F-150, she said. "It's been reliable up until today, but I think it might just be overwhelmed by the trailer. I've got all my furniture and my tack loaded up, and it's been struggling with the hills." Luke knew that truck. He'd seen Eleanor Quinn driving it around town for years, and he'd always respected the way she maintained her equipment. If it had quit running, there was probably a simple explanation that a competent mechanic could sort out in an hour or two. "I'll take a look," Luke said, surprising himself with the words. No charge, just being neighborly, the smile that spread. Across Maisie's face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, genuine and warm in a way that made Luke's chest tighten for entirely different reasons. "Thank you," she said. "I really appreciate it. I promise I won't take up too much of your time." Luke nodded and stepped down from the porch, grabbing his toolbox from the workshop without allowing himself to think too hard about what he was doing. As they walked toward the road together, Maisie filled the silence with the kind of easy conversation that Luke had forgotten was possible. "I can't believe how much the town has changed," she said. "Mrs. Henderson still runs the general store, and I swear the place looks exactly the same as it did when I was 10 years old. But there are new houses out by the highway, and somebody told me they're talking about putting in a proper restaurant." "Progress," Luke said, the word carrying just enough irony to make Maisie glance at him sideways. "You don't sound too enthusiastic about it." "Change usually means complications," Luke replied. "I prefer things simple." They reached the truck, and Luke could see immediately what the problem was. The radiator was leaking coolant, and the engine had overheated trying to pull the heavy trailer up the hill. It was exactly the kind of straightforward mechanical issue that Luke could fix with basic tools and a trip to the auto parts store. "Radiator hose," he said, pointing to the source of the leak. "Easy fix once the engine cools down. I can patch it for now and get you to town, but you'll need a new hose." "How much do you think that'll cost?" Maisie asked, and Luke caught the note of concern in her voice that suggested money was tighter than she wanted to admit. $20 for the hose, maybe 30 if you need coolant too. Luke studied her expression and made a decision that would have surprised him an hour earlier. "I've got some spare coolant back at the house, and I can probably find a hose that'll fit. Won't take long to get you running again." "I don't want to impose," Maisie said. "You've already been more help than I had any right to expect." "No imposition," Luke found himself saying. "Like I said, just being neighborly." As he worked on the truck, Maisie told him about her plans for the horse sanctuary. Her mother had left her the property and a modest inheritance, but the financial situation was more complicated than Eleanor had let on. There were debts and legal complications that Maisie was still trying to sort through, but she was determined to honor her mother's dream of providing a safe place for horses that had nowhere else to go. Luke listened without commenting, his attention apparently focused on the mechanical work, but he found himself absorbing every detail of Maisie's story. There was something compelling about her quiet determination, her willingness to take on a challenge that most people would have walked away from. It reminded him of his mother, in the brief years before illness had taken her strength and his. Father's anger had filled all the spaces where love might have lived. When the truck was running again, Maisie insisted on shaking Luke's hand to thank him. Her palm was warm and calloused, her grip firm but gentle, and Luke realized with a start that it had been months since he'd had any kind of physical contact with another human being. "I owe you one," she said. "If there's ever anything I can do to return the favor, just let me know." Luke nodded, already stepping back toward the safety of distance. "Good luck with the sanctuary," he said. As Maisie drove away, Luke stood in the road longer than necessary, watching the truck disappear around the curve toward the Quinn property. He told himself it was just curiosity about whether the repair would hold, but he knew that wasn't entirely true. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it would be like to have someone to talk to at the end of a long day. Someone who might understand that silence wasn't always unfriendliness, and that keeping your distance wasn't always the same as not caring. The thought unsettled him enough that he spent the rest of the day working harder than necessary, fixing things that didn't really need fixing and organizing tools that were already organized. By evening, he had almost convinced himself that the encounter with Maisie Quinn was just a momentary disruption in his routine, nothing more than a neighborly gesture that required no follow-up or further thought. But as he sat on his porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the valley, Luke found his gaze drifting toward the Quinn property. Smoke was rising from the chimney for the first time in 3 years, and lights glowed in windows that had been dark for too long. Someone was home again, and despite all his efforts to convince himself otherwise, Luke discovered that the knowledge made him feel something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. He felt less alone. 3 days later, Luke was replacing a section of rotted fence post when he heard the sound of hammering echoing across the valley. The rhythm was irregular, amateur, punctuated by what sounded like frustrated sighs carried on the morning breeze. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the satisfying work of setting a new post in concrete, but the hammering continued with the kind of persistence that suggested someone was determined to finish a job regardless of their skill level. By noon, curiosity had gotten the better of his usual policy of minding his own business. Luke found himself walking toward the property line that separated his land from the Quinn sanctuary, ostensibly to check the fence that ran along the boundary. The hammering had stopped, replaced by the sound of someone talking to themselves in tones that suggested things weren't going according to plan. Through the gap in the oak trees that marked the edge of his property, Luke could see Maisie standing, beside the old barn that had been the centerpiece of Eleanor Quinn's operation. She was holding a hammer in one hand and studying a piece of wood that appeared to have gotten the better of her, her head tilted in the universal pose of someone trying to figure out what went wrong. The barn needed work. That much was obvious, even from a distance. Several boards had come loose from the side wall, and the door hung at an angle that suggested the hinges were failing. It was the kind of repair job that required 2 people and a fair amount of experience with old buildings that had their own peculiar ways of settling and shifting over time. Luke stood at the fence line for several minutes, telling himself he was just taking a break from his own work. But when he saw Maisie climb onto an unstable-looking ladder to reach the upper wall, something in his chest tightened with a concern that had nothing to do with neighborly politeness. "That ladder's not safe for that kind of work," he called. Out before he could stop himself, Maisie startled at the sound of his voice and looked around until she spotted him standing by the fence. Even from 50 yards away, Luke could see the relief that crossed her face. "Luke, I was hoping I might see you again." She climbed down from the ladder with more haste than grace. "I don't suppose you know anything about barn repair?" "Some," Luke admitted, already knowing where this conversation was heading and unable to think of a graceful way to avoid it. "I'm trying to replace these loose boards before they fall off completely, but I think I might be in over my head." Maisie gestured toward the barn with the kind of rueful smile that acknowledged defeat without surrendering hope. "The whole thing seems to be held together by stubbornness and good intentions." Luke found himself walking through the gap in the fence that Eleanor Quinn had maintained for 20 years, ostensibly so the properties could share access to the creek that ran between them. He told himself he was just going to take a quick look, offer some advice, and get back to his own work. But as he got closer to the barn, Luke could see that the problem was more serious than a few loose boards. The foundation had shifted over, the winter throwing the entire structure slightly out of square. The door frame was twisted, several support beams were showing stress cracks, and the roof had at least 3 places where shingles had blown off and never been replaced. "This is going to take more than a hammer and some nails," Luke said, running his hand along one of the warped support beams. "That's what I was afraid of," Maisie said. "I called a contractor in town, but he wants $4,000 just to stabilize the structure. I don't have that kind of money right now." Luke studied the barn with the critical eye of someone who had spent years maintaining buildings that were held together by necessity and determination. The work was extensive but not impossible for someone who understood old construction techniques and had access to the right tools. "I could help you fix it," he heard himself saying, the words coming out before his rational mind could intervene with all the reasons why getting involved was a bad idea. "Luke, I can't ask you to do that," Maisie said, but there was hope in her voice that suggested she wanted to be convinced. "This is way more than just being neighborly. You didn't ask. I offered." Luke surprised himself with the firmness in his voice. "I've got the tools and the experience, and it's not like I'm busy with anything that can't wait. What would you charge for something like this?" "Nothing," Luke said, the word coming out more sharply than he'd intended. "I don't do this for money." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. and Luke realized that his response had revealed more about his character than he usually allowed strangers to see. Maisie was studying his face with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was trying to understand something important. "Then let me at least feed you while you work," she said finally. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage breakfast and lunch, and there's always coffee." Luke nodded, already wondering what he'd gotten himself into, but unable to think of a way to back out that wouldn't make him look like a fool or a coward. "I can start tomorrow morning if that works for you." "It works perfectly," Maisie said, and the smile that accompanied her words was warm enough to make Luke feel like he'd made the right decision, despite all evidence to the contrary. They spent the next hour walking around the barn while Luke pointed out the various problems and explained what would need to be done to fix them. Maisie listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate repairs to the long-term maintenance of the property. As they worked their way around to the back of the barn, Maisie told Luke about her mother's vision for the sanctuary. Eleanor Quinn had started with 3 rescued horses and had gradually built a reputation for taking in animals that other people had given up on. At its peak, the sanctuary had housed 15 horses, each with its own story of neglect or abuse, that had been transformed into a second chance at a peaceful life. She had this gift for seeing past the damage to what was still good in them, Maisie said, running her hand along the weathered boards of the barn wall. "I remember coming home from school and finding her in the paddock with some horse that everyone said was too dangerous to handle, just talking to it like it was an old friend." Luke understood that kind of patience. He'd spent enough time with damaged animals to know that healing took time, and that trust was something that had to be earned rather than demanded. There was something in the way Maisie talked about her mother's work that suggested she had inherited more than just the property. "You planning to take in horses yourself?" Luke asked. "That's the idea," Maisie said. "There are 3 coming next week, all senior horses that their owners can't afford to keep anymore. Nothing dramatic, just animals that need a safe place to live out their remaining years." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Luke looked toward the house and saw a black sedan that looked expensive and out of place against the rural backdrop of the sanctuary. A man in a business suit got out of the car and walked toward them with the purposeful stride of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. "Ms. Quinn," the man called out, "I'm Marcus Henley from First National Bank. I believe we have an appointment." Luke saw Maisie's expression change, the easy warmth of their conversation replaced by something that looked like dread mixed with resignation. She glanced at Luke as if she wanted to ask him to stay but couldn't quite find the words. "I should probably get back to my own work," Luke said, recognizing the signs of private business that didn't concern him. "Luke, wait," Maisie said, and before he could react, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a brief hug. "Thank you for offering to help with the barn. I really appreciate it." The contact lasted only a few seconds, but for Luke, it might as well have been a lifetime. He stood frozen in place, his arms at his sides, overwhelmed by sensations he hadn't experienced since his mother had hugged him goodbye on the morning she went to the hospital for the last time. The warmth of another person's body pressed against his, the scent of shampoo and honest work, the simple human comfort of being touched with affection rather than anger. When Maisie stepped back, Luke could see in her eyes that she understood the significance of what had just happened, even if she didn't understand the reasons behind his reaction. He managed a nod and turned away, walking back toward his own property with steps that felt unsteady beneath him. Behind him, he could hear Maisie greeting the banker with professional politeness that couldn't quite hide her anxiety. Luke didn't need to hear the details of their conversation to understand that money troubles were threatening the sanctuary before it had even properly reopened. As he walked home, Luke's mind was spinning with unfamiliar emotions and half-formed thoughts that he couldn't quite organize into coherent understanding. The hug had awakened something in him that he'd thought was safely buried, a hunger for human connection that was both terrifying and compelling. That night, Luke sat on his porch long after dark, staring toward the lights in the Quinn house and trying to make sense of what he was feeling. For 34 years, he had built his life around the certainty that solitude was safer than vulnerability, that keeping his distance from other people was the only way to avoid the kind of pain that had defined his childhood. But Maisie Quinn's brief embrace had shattered that certainty with the force of a revelation. For the first time in his adult life, Luke found himself wondering what it would be like to let someone close enough to hurt him, and whether the risk might be worth taking. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Luke lay in his childhood bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since he was 12. His mind replaying those few seconds of human contact with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel Maisie's arms around him again, could smell the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair, could remember the way she had looked at him afterward, not with pity or curiosity, but with a kind of gentle understanding that suggested she saw more than he was comfortable revealing. He'd gotten up twice to walk around the house, checking locks that didn't need checking and straightening things that were already straight. The third time he found himself standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, he finally admitted that he wasn't going to get any rest until he figured out what was happening to him. Luke opened the cupboard above the stove and pulled down the old coffee tin that he kept hidden behind the flour canister. His hands shook slightly as he pried off the lid, revealing the few precious objects that connected him to the woman who had loved him before he learned that love was dangerous. The wedding ring was thin and simple, worn smooth by years of hard work and careful polishing. His mother had taken it off only once that he could remember, when she was in the hospital and her fingers had grown too swollen for jewelry. She'd pressed it into his 12-year-old palm and made him promise to keep it safe, though she'd never explained why it mattered so much. Beside the ring lay a photograph, creased and faded, but still clear enough to show a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, holding a baby in a white christening gown. Luke's mother had been barely 20 when the picture was taken, younger than Maisie was now, and there was something in her expression that spoke of hope and joy that would be gradually worn away by his father's anger and disappointment. The letter was folded carefully, written in his mother's careful script on stationery that she'd saved for special occasions. Luke had read it so many times that he knew every word by heart, but he unfolded it anyway, needing to see her handwriting and remember her voice. "My dearest Luke," it began, "if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead to wait for you, and I need you to know some things that I should have told you while I had the chance. You are not your father, sweetheart. You have his stubbornness and his strong hands, but you have my heart, and that makes all the difference. Don't let his anger become your anger. Don't let his fear of love become your fear. You were made for gentleness, even if this hard world tries to convince you otherwise. I know it's going to be difficult for you, growing up in that house without someone to remind you that kindness isn't weakness. But I need you to remember that the love I have for you doesn't end just because I'm not there to show it anymore. It lives in you now, and someday you're going to find someone who deserves to receive it. When that day comes, don't be afraid to let them see who you really are underneath all that armor you're going to build. Love always." Mama Luke folded the letter carefully and returned it to the tin along with the ring and photograph. His mother had been wrong about some things. Gentleness had been beaten out of him long before he was old enough to choose his own path. But as he sat in his dark kitchen, thinking about Maisie Quinn's embrace, he wondered if maybe it wasn't too late to remember who he might have been if circumstances had been different. Dawn came grey and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look smaller and more urgent. Luke dressed in his work clothes and loaded his truck with the tools he'd need for the barn repairs, trying to convince himself that this was just another job, no different from the dozens of other maintenance projects he'd tackled over the years. But as he drove toward the Quinn property, he found himself checking his appearance in the rearview mirror and wondering if he should have shaved more carefully or worn a cleaner shirt. It had been so long since he'd cared what anyone thought of him that the vanity felt foreign and uncomfortable. Maisie was waiting for him beside the barn, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her clothes already bearing the stains of someone who'd been up early doing physical work. She waved when she saw his truck, and Luke felt something ease in his chest at the genuine warmth of her greeting. "I wasn't sure you'd still want to do this," she said as he climbed out of the truck. "I know yesterday got a little complicated." "A commitment's a commitment," Luke said, though they both knew he could have found a dozen excuses to back out if he'd wanted to. "How'd the meeting with the banker go?" Maisie's expression tightened slightly. "About as well as expected. We've got 90 days to come up with a significant payment on the mortgage, or the bank is going to foreclose. Apparently, my mother borrowed against the property to help some other families who were struggling, and she didn't mention that little detail in any of the paperwork she left me." Luke nodded, understanding more than she probably realized about the weight of inheriting other people's noble intentions along with their debts. 90 days is enough time to figure something out. "That's what I keep telling myself," Maisie said. "But I'm going to need to get the sanctuary operational a lot faster than I originally planned. Having a safe, functional barn is going to be essential for attracting donations and potential sponsors." They spent the morning working in companionable silence, Luke directing the structural repairs while Maisie helped with the simpler tasks that didn't require specialized knowledge. She was a quick learner and wasn't afraid of getting dirty, qualities that Luke respected in anyone but found particularly surprising in someone who'd spent years living in cities. "You've done this kind of work before," Luke observed as Maisie competently handled the tools he handed her. "My mother made sure I knew how to fix things," Maisie said. "She always said that if you're going to live in the country, you need to be able to solve your own problems, because help might be a long time coming." Luke found himself thinking about his own childhood, about all the times he'd watched his father struggle with repairs that required patience and precision rather than brute force. His mother had been the one with gentle hands and a talent for coaxing broken things back to usefulness, but his father had never let her near anything he considered men's work. Around noon, they broke for lunch, sitting on the tailgate of Luke's truck and sharing the sandwiches that Maisie had prepared that morning. The conversation was easier than Luke had expected, filled with practical discussions about the best way to approach the remaining repairs and Maisie's plans for the horses that would be arriving soon. "I know this might sound presumptuous," Maisie said as they were finishing their meal, "but I get the feeling you understand animals the way my mother did. There's something about the way you move around them, like you're listening to what they're not saying." Luke considered this observation, surprised by its accuracy. "Animals don't lie about what they need," he said finally. "They don't pretend to be something they're not, and they don't expect you to be anything other than what you are. Makes them easier to understand than most people." "Is that why you prefer living alone?" The question was asked gently, without judgment, but Luke felt his defenses rising automatically. He'd learned long ago that personal questions led to personal revelations, and personal revelations led to vulnerability that could be used against him later. "I prefer things simple," he said, using the same words he'd offered 3 days earlier. "Simple isn't always the same as easy," Maisie said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood more about his choices than he was comfortable with. Luke nodded and stood up, ready to get back to work and away from conversations that probed too close to truths he wasn't ready to examine. But as they returned to the barn, he found himself thinking about her words and wondering if maybe the life he'd built for himself was more about avoiding difficulty than pursuing simplicity. The afternoon passed quickly, with Luke focused on the technical challenges of stabilizing the barn's foundation while Maisie worked on cleaning and organizing the interior space. They developed an easy rhythm of cooperation, anticipating each other's needs and moving around each other with the kind of efficiency that usually took weeks to develop. As the sun began to set, Luke realized that he'd spent an entire day working alongside another person without feeling the usual tension that came from being observed and evaluated. Maisie didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't offer unwanted advice, and didn't seem to expect conversation when silence was more comfortable. "We made good progress today," she said, as they cleaned up their tools. "I think we might actually be able to get this finished before the horses arrive." Luke nodded, surprised by how much he was looking forward to continuing the work tomorrow. For the first time in years, he had something to anticipate beyond the routine maintenance of his solitary life. "Same time tomorrow?" Maisie asked. "I'll be here," Luke said, and meant it more than he cared to admit. The next morning brought the first genuinely warm day of spring, with clear skies and the kind of gentle breeze that made outdoor work feel like a privilege rather than a chore. Luke arrived at the sanctuary to find Maisie already busy in the barn, mucking out stalls and preparing the space for its new occupants. She looked up when she heard his truck, and the smile that lit her face made something shift in Luke's chest that he was beginning to recognize as happiness. "Perfect timing," she called out. "I just put on a fresh pot of coffee, and I think I might have figured out what's wrong with the water system." Luke followed her to the small office that Eleanor Quinn had built into one corner of the barn. It was a practical space with a desk, filing cabinets, and a small kitchenette that had seen better days. The coffee pot was indeed brewing, filling the air with the rich aroma that Luke had come to associate with civilized mornings. The previous owners rigged up some kind of gravity-fed system for the water troughs, Maisie explained, pointing to a hand-drawn diagram that someone had tacked to the wall. "But I think one of the main lines is blocked somewhere between the well and the barn." Luke studied the diagram, recognizing his neighbor's methodical approach to problem-solving. Eleanor Quinn had been an engineer before she'd turned to horse rescue, and her solutions tended to be both elegant and practical. "That's probably why your water pressure in the house is so low," Luke said. "If the main line is partially blocked, it's affecting the whole system. Is that something we can fix ourselves, or do I need to call a plumber?" Luke considered the question, while accepting the mug of coffee that Maisie offered him. It was strong and hot, exactly the way he preferred it, and he found himself wondering if she'd remembered his preference from their previous conversations, or if they simply shared similar tastes. "Depends on where the blockage is," he said. "If it's in the line itself, we might be able to clear it with a snake or high-pressure water. If it's a collapsed pipe, that's a bigger job." They spent the next hour tracing the water lines from the well to the various buildings on the property. Luke had brought a metal detector that could locate buried pipes, and Maisie proved surprisingly adept at interpreting the readings and marking the path of the main line. The work required them to move in close coordination, with Luke operating the detector while Maisie marked the ground with spray paint. Several times, their hands brushed as they traded tools or pointed out landmarks, and Luke found himself becoming less startled by the casual contact. It wasn't the overwhelming experience that the hug had been, but rather a gradual acclimatization to the idea that human touch didn't have to be threatening. "Found it," Luke announced, as the detector began beeping insistently near the corner of the barn. "There's definitely something here that doesn't belong." They dug carefully, working together to excavate the area around the buried pipe. About 3 feet down, they found the problem. A section of PVC pipe that had been crushed by the weight of a large boulder that had somehow worked its way into the soil over the years. "How do you suppose that got there?" Maisie asked, wiping sweat from her forehead and leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. "Frost heave, probably," Luke said. "Happens when the ground freezes and thaws repeatedly. Rocks can migrate quite a distance over time. As they worked to remove the boulder and replace the damaged pipe, their conversation gradually shifted from the technical details of the repair to more personal topics. Maisie told Luke about her years working in Denver, managing a non-profit organization that provided job training for veterans transitioning to civilian life. "It was rewarding work," she said, "but I always felt like I was treating the symptoms rather than addressing the real problem. These men and women had given so much to serve their country, and then they came home to a system that didn't know how to value what they had to offer." Luke found himself thinking about his own brief stint in the military, the 2 years he'd spent trying to escape Millfield and his father's legacy before realizing that geography couldn't solve the problems he carried inside himself. He'd come home after his father's death with skills he'd never used and experiences he'd never shared with anyone. "What made you decide to come back here?" he asked. "Honestly, I was tired of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere," Maisie said. "I loved the work I was doing, but I missed having roots. I missed knowing my neighbors and being able to walk outside without feeling like I was surrounded by strangers." Luke understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. He'd spent his entire adult life in the same place where he'd grown up, but he'd never felt like he belonged there either. He was tolerated rather than welcomed, respected for his competence, but never included in the kind of casual social interactions that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. "Plus," Maisie continued, "I kept thinking about all the horses my mother had helped over the years, and how many more animals are out there that need a safe place to heal. It seemed like maybe I could do more good here than I was doing in the city." By mid-afternoon, they had the water system working again, and Luke was surprised to realize that he was reluctant to see the day's work come to an end. Working alongside Maisie had been the most pleasant day he'd had in longer than he could remember, and the prospect of returning to his empty house felt less appealing than usual. "I was thinking," Maisie said as they cleaned their tools, "would you'd like to stay for dinner? It's not much, just spaghetti and salad, but I hate cooking for one person, and you've done so much work today." The invitation caught Luke off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how much he wanted to accept it. Sharing a meal implied a level of intimacy that went beyond their working relationship, a recognition that they enjoyed each other's company for reasons that had nothing to do with barn repairs or water pipes. "I don't want to impose," Luke said, falling back on the polite deflection that had served him well for years. "You wouldn't be imposing," Maisie said. "I'm asking because I'd like the company." Luke looked at her face, searching for signs of the obligation or pity that he'd learned to recognize in other people's offers of inclusion. But Maisie's expression was open and genuine, free of any agenda beyond the simple desire to share a meal with someone she liked. "All right," he said, the word coming out more easily than he'd expected. "I'd like that." Dinner was indeed simple: spaghetti with meat sauce, green salad, and garlic bread that Maisie had made from scratch. But it was the first home-cooked meal Luke had shared with another person in more years than he cared to count, and he found himself savoring not just the food, but the whole experience of sitting across a table from someone who wanted to hear about his day. "Tell me about your ranch," Maisie said as they ate. "How long has it been in your family?" "My grandfather bought the land in 1952, Luke said. 50 acres that nobody else wanted because the soil was too rocky for serious farming. But it was cheap, and he figured he could make it work with cattle and determination. Sounds like it runs in the family." Luke considered this observation, thinking about the different kinds of determination that had shaped 3 generations of Maddox men. His grandfather had been driven by hope and possibility, his father by anger and disappointment. Luke wasn't sure what drove him, but sitting in Maisie's kitchen, he found himself thinking that maybe it was time to figure that out. As the evening wore on, Luke discovered the conversation with Maisie was easier than he'd expected. She had a gift for asking questions that invited sharing without demanding it, and she listened with the kind of attention that made him feel like his words mattered. When it was time to leave, Luke found himself lingering by the door, reluctant. To break the spell of an evening that had felt almost normal, Maisie walked him to his truck, and for a moment they stood in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the sounds of settling horses and evening birds. "Thank you for dinner," Luke said. "And for the company." "Thank you for all your help," Maisie replied. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Luke nodded and climbed into his truck, but as he drove home, he found himself thinking that maybe he couldn't have done this without her either. For the first time in his adult life, he was beginning to understand what his mother had meant about being made for gentleness, and what it might feel like to let someone see who he really was underneath all the armor he'd spent years building. The horses arrived on a Thursday morning in a trailer that had seen better days, driven by a weathered man named Carlos, who spoke in gentle tones to the animals he was delivering. Luke had come over early to help with the unloading, curious despite himself about the creatures that would be sharing the sanctuary with Maisie. The first horse down the ramp was a grey mare named Stella, 23 years old, with arthritic joints and eyes that had seen too much of the world's hardness. She moved carefully, favoring her left front leg, but there was dignity in the way she held her head as she surveyed her new surroundings. She was a therapy horse for disabled children, Maisie explained as they led Stella to her stall. Worked for 15 years before her arthritis got too bad for the program. Her previous owners couldn't afford the special care she needs, but they couldn't bear to put her down either. Luke watched Maisie's hands as she gently examined Stella's legs, noting the practiced way she moved around the horse and the calm confidence in her voice. There was something about her touch that reminded him of his mother's gentle handling of injured animals, a quality that seemed to communicate safety and understanding without the need for words. The second horse was a chestnut gelding named Murphy, who had spent most of his 25 years as a ranch horse before a back injury ended his working career. He was skittish around strangers, his ears constantly moving as he monitored potential threats, but he settled visibly when Maisie spoke to him in the same quiet tones she'd used with Stella. "He's going to need time to trust again," Maisie said, offering Murphy a handful of grain. His previous owners weren't cruel, but they weren't particularly gentle either. He's learned to expect that humans mean work and pain. Luke understood that kind of wariness. He found himself studying Murphy's defensive posture and recognizing something familiar in the way the horse kept his distance while simultaneously watching for signs of kindness. The third horse was the smallest, a pinto mare named Rosie, who had been rescued from a neglect situation. She was thin but not emaciated, her coat dull from poor nutrition, but her spirit apparently intact. Unlike Murphy, she seemed genuinely curious about her new environment, exploring her stall with the careful optimism of someone who had learned not to expect much, but was willing to hope anyway. "She's the one I'm most worried about," Maisie admitted, as they watched Rosie investigate her feed bucket. "The vet says she's physically healthy, but she's never learned to trust humans. She's been passed around between different homes since she was a foal, and nobody's ever taken the time to really work with her." Luke spent the morning helping Maisie settle the horses into their new home, carrying water buckets and hay bales, while she established routines that would help the animals feel secure. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed the work, and even more surprised by how naturally he seemed to understand what each horse needed. When Murphy shied away from the sound of a dropping hammer, Luke instinctively moved slower and spoke in lower tones. When Stella showed signs of pain while walking to the paddock, he suggested a different route that avoided the uneven ground near the barn. When Rosie seemed overwhelmed by all the activity, he quietly moved his work to the far side of the barn, to give her space to adjust. "You're good with them," Maisie observed as they took a break for lunch. "Have you worked with horses before?" "Some," Luke said, thinking about the horses his family had kept over the years. "My grandfather always said that horses are honest animals. They'll tell you exactly what they're thinking if you know how to listen. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man." Luke nodded, remembering the hours he'd spent as a child listening to stories about his grandfather's experiences, breaking wild horses and building a life from nothing but determination and hope. Those memories felt precious now, untainted by his father's later bitterness and anger. "He died when I was 8, Luke said, "but I remember him being patient with everything, animals, people, even broken equipment. My father always said patience was just another word for weakness, but I think maybe my grandfather understood something that my father never did." The admission surprised Luke with its openness. He wasn't used to sharing family history with anyone, but something about working alongside Maisie made personal conversation feel natural rather than threatening. "What do you think your grandfather understood?" Luke considered the question while watching Rosie explore her paddock with cautious curiosity. "That some things can't be forced," he said finally. "That trust and healing take time, and rushing. The process usually just makes things worse. That's exactly what my mother used to say about the horses she worked with," Maisie said. "She always told me that patience wasn't passive. It was an active choice to believe that things could get better if you were willing to wait for them." They spent the afternoon establishing routines for the horses' care, with Maisie teaching Luke the specific needs of each animal, and Luke contributing practical solutions for making the daily work more efficient. By evening, they had developed a system that would allow one person to manage all 3 horses while still providing individual attention to each. As they finished the evening feeding, Luke found himself reluctant to leave. The sanctuary felt alive in a way that his own property never had, filled with purpose and the quiet satisfaction that came from caring for creatures that needed help. For the first time in years, he was part of something larger than his own survival. "I was thinking," Maisie said as they cleaned the feed buckets, "would you be interested in helping me on a regular basis? I know you have your own ranch to manage, but I could really use someone who understands animals the way you do." The offer was tempting for reasons that went beyond his growing attachment to the horses. Working at the sanctuary meant spending time with Maisie, meant being part of her mission to provide healing for damaged creatures, meant having a purpose that extended beyond the maintenance of his solitary existence. "What kind of regular?" Luke asked. "Maybe a few hours in the morning, helping with feeding and exercise. I could pay you something, though it wouldn't be much until the sanctuary gets more established." "I don't need payment," Luke said automatically, "but I'd be willing to help." "Are you sure? I don't want to take advantage of your generosity." Luke looked around the barn, taking in the sight of 3 horses who had found safety and care because Maisie had been willing to take on their troubles. He thought about his mother's letter, about her belief that he was made for gentleness, about the possibility that maybe it wasn't too late to become the person she had seen in him. "I'm sure," he said. "I'd like to be part of this." That night, Luke sat on his porch with a bottle of beer and watched the lights in the Quinn house, thinking about the changes that had come into his life over the past 2 weeks. The scared, defensive man who had reluctantly helped fix a stranger's truck seemed like someone from a distant past, replaced by someone who was willing to commit to caring for other living creatures. He thought about his father's empty liquor bottle, still sitting in the kitchen cupboard where Luke had left it years ago as a reminder of what he was determined not to become. His father had been a man who believed that the world was fundamentally hostile, that other people were sources of disappointment and pain, that the only safety lay in keeping everyone at arm's length. But watching Maisie work with the horses, seeing the way they gradually relaxed in her presence, Luke was beginning to understand that maybe his father had been wrong about more than just the nature of human relationships. Maybe the world was full of opportunities for gentleness, for healing, for the kind of patient love that could transform even the most damaged spirits. For the first time in his adult life, Luke found himself looking forward to tomorrow, not just as another day to be endured, but as another chance to be useful, to be needed, to be part of something that mattered. It was a strange and wonderful feeling, and as he finished his beer and headed inside, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to feel this way permanently. The morning routine at the sanctuary quickly became the best part of Luke's day. He found himself waking earlier than necessary, eager to check on the horses and spend those quiet dawn hours working alongside Maisie before the rest of the world demanded their attention. There was something almost sacred about those moments, filled with the gentle sounds of horses eating breakfast and the easy conversation that came with shared purpose. 3 weeks after the horses' arrival, Luke was mucking out Stella's stall when he heard the sound of papers rustling in the office area. Through the open door, he could see Maisie sitting at the old desk with a shoebox full of documents spread out before her, her expression troubled as she sorted through what appeared to be financial records. "Find something interesting?" Luke asked, setting aside his pitchfork and joining her in the small office space. "More like something concerning," Maisie said, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. "I've been going through all of my mother's records, trying to get a complete picture of the sanctuary's finances, and I keep finding evidence of loans and payments that don't make sense." Luke studied the document she handed him. It was a promissory note in Eleanor Quinn's handwriting, promising to pay back a sum of money to someone named Rodriguez within 90 days. The date was from 2 years ago, and there was no indication that the loan had ever been repaid. "How many of these are there?" "At least a dozen that I've found so far," Maisie said, her voice heavy with concern. "Small amounts mostly, between $500 and $2,000 each, but they add up to more than $15,000 in total." Luke whistled softly. "That's a lot of money for someone on a fixed income. The thing is, I can't figure out what she needed the money for. The sanctuary's regular expenses are all documented and accounted for, and there's no evidence that she was having any major financial problems until right before she died." Maisie pulled out a leather-bound journal from the bottom of the shoebox, its pages filled with her mother's careful handwriting. "I found this hidden in the back of the filing cabinet. It's like a private record of all these transactions, but the entries are cryptic. Look at this one." She opened the journal to a page marked with a bookmark and pointed to an entry from 18 months earlier. In Eleanor's neat script, it read, "Martinez family, Palin $200 for truck repair. They have 3 children and winter is coming. Sometimes helping others help themselves is the best investment we can make." Luke felt something shift in his understanding of Eleanor Quinn. She was loaning money to people in town. "Not loaning," Maisie said, flipping through more pages. "Look at the rest of these entries." The Rodriguez note was for medical bills when their daughter broke her arm. The Henderson family got money for heating oil when the husband lost his job. The Williams family got help with their mortgage payment when the farm had a bad year. Luke read through several more entries, each one documenting Eleanor's quiet generosity to families in crisis. The amounts were always modest, but clearly significant to the recipients, and in every case, Eleanor had documented not just the financial assistance, but the circumstances that had prompted her to help. She was giving away money that she didn't have, Maisie said softly. "That's why the sanctuary is in debt now. She mortgaged the property to help other people, and she never told anyone what she was doing." The revelation explained the financial crisis that threatened the sanctuary, but it also painted a picture of Eleanor Quinn that made Luke's chest tighten with recognition. He thought about his mother's belief that he was made for gentleness, about the kind of person who would sacrifice their own security to help others in need. "Do any of these families know about the situation with the sanctuary?" Luke asked. "I don't think so. From what I can tell, my mother was very discreet about her help. She probably didn't want anyone to feel obligated or embarrassed." Luke studied Maisie's face, noting the mixture of pride and worry in her expression. "What are you thinking about doing?" "I don't know," Maisie admitted. "Part of me wants to contact these families and let them know what's happening. Maybe some of them are in a position to help now, Or maybe they could spread the word about the sanctuary's mission. But another part of me thinks that would be betraying my mother's trust. She obviously didn't want anyone to know about her generosity. Luke understood the dilemma. Eleanor's private charity had been an act of love, not a calculated investment. In future, reciprocity. But the consequences of her generosity now threatened the very mission she had devoted her life to building. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Luke said finally. "She was," Maisie said, closing the journal, "with gentle hands, but her kindness might end up costing me everything she worked to build." They spent the rest of the morning working in thoughtful silence, each absorbed in their own reflections about the weight of inherited responsibilities and the complexity of doing good in a world that didn't always reward generous hearts. Luke found himself thinking about his own mother's letter, about her belief that love was meant to be shared rather than hoarded, about the possibility that some risks were worth taking even when the outcome was uncertain. Around noon, they were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Luke looked out to see Sheriff Tom Bradley climbing out of his patrol car, his expression serious in a way that suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Maisie Quinn," Sheriff Bradley called out as he approached the barn. "That's me," Maisie said, stepping out to meet him. "Is everything all right, Sheriff?" "I'm afraid I've got some troubling news," Bradley said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering unpleasant official business. "I've been asked to serve you with some legal papers regarding the property." Luke felt his muscles tense as Bradley handed Maisie a manila envelope. Legal papers usually meant lawyers, and lawyers usually meant that someone with money and influence was making life difficult for someone without those advantages. Maisie opened the envelope and scanned the documents inside, her face growing pale as she read. "I don't understand," she said. "This says that Crane Morrison is challenging my ownership of the property based on some kind of boundary dispute. Morrison claims that the eastern boundary of your property has been incorrectly surveyed for decades." Bradley explained. "He's filed a lawsuit alleging that approximately 15 acres of what you think is your land actually belongs to his ranch." Luke felt anger rise in his chest like a sudden fever. Crane Morrison was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county, a man who had built his empire by acquiring struggling properties and consolidating them into his ever-expanding operation. The idea that he would target a horse sanctuary run by a woman who was already struggling financially struck Luke as both predictable and despicable. 15 acres, Maisie repeated, her voice hollow. That would include the main pasture and the southern paddocks. Without that land, the sanctuary wouldn't be viable. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news," Bradley said, "but you'll need to respond to this lawsuit within 30 days, and I'd strongly recommend getting yourself a lawyer." After the sheriff left, Maisie sank down on a hay bale, the legal documents clutched in her hands. Luke could see the weight of accumulated challenges settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "This is Morrison's way of forcing me out," she said quietly. "Even if his claim is completely bogus, I can't afford to fight a lengthy legal battle. He knows that." Luke looked at the papers over her shoulder, studying the technical language that was designed to intimidate rather than inform. But beneath the legal jargon, he could see the outline of a strategy that was both ruthless and effective. "We'll figure something out," he said, the words coming out with more conviction than he felt. "We?" Maisie looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, we," Luke said firmly. "You're not facing this alone." It was the first time in his adult life that Luke had voluntarily committed himself to someone else's fight. But as he looked around the sanctuary that had become so important to him, he realized that some things were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. The next 3 days passed in a blur of research and growing frustration as Luke and Maisie tried to understand the legal challenge they were facing. They spent hours at the county clerk's office, poring over property records and survey maps that seemed to contradict each other more than they clarified anything. The boundary dispute that Morrison claimed was straightforward appeared to be anything but simple when examined closely. Luke found himself thinking about people he'd served. Within the military, men and women who had become experts at navigating bureaucratic systems and cutting through official obfuscation. On Thursday evening, he made a phone call to his former sergeant, Maria Santos, who had retired from the army and now worked as a paralegal in San Antonio. "Luke Maddox," Maria said when she answered the phone, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I was wondering when you'd finally call. How are you doing, you old hermit?" "I'm doing well, Maria. Better than I have in a long time, actually." Luke found himself smiling at the familiar sound of her voice. "But I'm calling because I need some advice about a legal situation." Luke explained the circumstances of Morrison's lawsuit, describing the boundary dispute and the financial pressures that made it impossible for Maisie to mount an effective defense. Maria listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification on technical details. "This sounds like a classic land grab," Maria said when Luke finished his explanation. "Rich guy uses the legal system to squeeze out someone who can't afford to fight back. But you know what, Luke? Sometimes these bullies make mistakes when they get too confident." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind where they don't do their homework properly before they file their paperwork. Tell me, has anyone actually done a professional survey of the disputed boundary?" Luke thought about the documents they'd reviewed. "Morrison's lawsuit references a survey from 1987, but I haven't seen any recent work." "That's interesting. Property boundaries can shift over time, especially in areas with significant water features or geological changes. And sometimes old surveys were just plain wrong to begin with." Maria paused, and Luke could hear the sound of typing in the background. "Listen, I've got a friend who does investigative research for law firms. Her name is Carmen Rodriguez, and she specializes in property disputes. Let me give her a call and see if she'd be willing to take a look at your situation." "Maria, I can't afford to pay for professional research." "Who said anything about paying? Carmen owes me a favor from a case we worked on last year. Besides, she's got a soft spot for people who rescue animals. Let me reach out to her and see what she can find." Luke felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "I'd appreciate that more than I can say. Don't thank me yet. But Luke, it sounds like you found something worth fighting for." "I'm glad." The next morning, Luke was feeding the horses when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as Carmen Rodriguez. "Maria Santos asked me to take a look at your property situation," Carmen said without preamble. "I've spent the last 12 hours digging through records, and I think you're going to find what I discovered very interesting." Luke felt his pulse quicken. "What did you find? Can you meet me at the courthouse in an hour? I need to show you some documents that I think are going to change everything about this case." Luke called Maisie and asked her to meet him at the courthouse, explaining only that Carmen had found something important. When they arrived, they found Carmen waiting for them in the research room, surrounded by stacks of papers and maps that she had spread across 3 tables. Carmen Rodriguez was a small woman with sharp eyes and the kind of intense energy that suggested she approached her work with the dedication of a detective. She stood up when Luke and Maisie entered, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite hide her excitement. "You must be Maisie Quinn," Carmen said. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. I think you're going to be very interested in what I've discovered about Mr. Morrison's property claims." She led them to a table covered with survey maps and legal documents, some of which appeared to be quite old. "Let me start with what Morrison's lawsuit claims," Carmen said, pointing to a modern map that showed the disputed boundary. "According to his filing, this eastern boundary of your property has been incorrectly surveyed since the 1960s, and these 15 acres rightfully belong to his ranch." "That's what the papers say," Maisie confirmed. "Right? But here's where it gets interesting. Carmen pulled out a folder filled with older documents. I went back to the original land grants from when this area was first settled. Your property was established in 1923 as part of a homestead grant to the Quinn family. Morrison's ranch was assembled over time from multiple smaller properties that he purchased between 1975 and 1995. Luke studied the older maps, noting the careful survey marks and property descriptions that had been used to establish the original boundaries. Now, look at this, Carmen continued, pulling out a document that was yellow with age. This is the original survey of Morrison's ranch from 1976, when he bought the first parcel adjacent to your family's land. According to this survey, the boundary between the properties follows the creek bed for approximately 2 miles before turning due north. That matches what we've always understood about our boundary, Maisie said. Exactly. But here's the really interesting part. Carmen spread out a different map, this one showing a much larger area. I pulled the records for all of Morrison's property acquisitions over the past 30 years, and I found something that I don't think he was counting on anyone discovering. She pointed to a section of Morrison's ranch that was located several miles south of the Quinn property. In 1989, Morrison purchased this 400-acre parcel from the Herrera family. According to the deed, this land had been in the Herrera family since 1847, when it was granted to them as part of a Mexican land grant that was recognized by the Texas government after statehood. Luke frowned, not understanding the significance of this information. What does that have to do with our boundary dispute? Carmen's smile widened. Everything, as it turns out. I did some additional research into the Herrera family's ownership of that land, and I discovered that the 1989 sale to Morrison was never legally valid. She pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. The Herrera land grant included specific provisions about how the property could be transferred. According to the original grant, the land could only be sold with the unanimous consent of all adult family members, and the sale had to be witnessed by a representative of the Mexican consulate. Was Morrison's purchase done properly? Maisie asked. Not even close. The land was sold by one family member without consulting the others, and there was no consular witness. According to both Mexican and Texas law, the sale was invalid from the beginning. Carmen paused for effect. Which means that Morrison has been illegally occupying 400 acres of land for the past 34 years. Luke felt a surge of something that was part excitement and part righteous anger. So Morrison is essentially a squatter on land that doesn't belong to him. That's exactly what he is. And here's the beautiful part. The current heirs of the Herrera family still have legal standing to reclaim their property. I've already made contact with them, and they're very interested in pursuing their claim. Maisie sat down heavily in the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the implications of Carmen's discovery. So, if Morrison is vulnerable to losing his own land, he's probably not in a strong position to be challenging other people's property rights. More than that, Carmen said. If this information becomes public, Morrison could face serious legal consequences for knowingly occupying land that wasn't legally sold to him. He's built a significant part of his ranch operation on property that he has no right to own. Luke looked at the documents spread across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what Carmen had uncovered. Morrison's aggressive legal challenge to the sanctuary had been based on the assumption that Maisie couldn't afford to fight back. But now the situation was completely reversed. What do we do with this information? Luke asked. That depends on what you want to accomplish, Carmen said. You could use it defensively to force Morrison to drop his lawsuit against the sanctuary. Or you could go on the offensive and help the Herrera family reclaim their rightful property. Or both, Maisie said quietly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. We could help the Herrera family get their land back and ensure that Morrison can never threaten the sanctuary again. Luke felt a familiar tightness in his chest, But this time it wasn't fear or anxiety. It was the feeling of standing at a crossroads, where the choice he made would define not just his own future, but the kind of person he wanted to be. "How do we contact the Herrera family?" he asked. Carmen's smile was answer enough. For the first time since Sheriff Bradley had delivered Morrison's legal papers, Luke felt like they had a chance not just to save the sanctuary, but to right a wrong that had been festering for more than 3 decades. As they left the courthouse, with Carmen's research carefully organized in a manila folder, Luke realized that the scared, isolated man who had reluctantly helped fix a stranger's truck was gone completely. In his place stood someone who was ready to fight for justice, for the people he cared about, and for the belief that sometimes the powerful could be held accountable for their actions. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, like waking up from a long sleep to discover that the world was full of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. The meeting with the Herrera family was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center in Millfield. Luke spent the week leading up to it in a state of nervous anticipation that was entirely foreign to his usual emotional landscape. For years, his biggest concerns had been managing his own property and avoiding unnecessary complications. Now he found himself at the center of a legal strategy that could reshape the power dynamics of his entire community. On Friday evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset over the valley, Luke retrieved the small wooden box from his bedroom that held his military medals. He hadn't looked at them in 5 years, hadn't thought about the man he'd been during those 2 years of service when he'd learned that he was capable of courage under pressure. The bronze star felt heavier than he remembered, its ribbon faded but the metal still bearing the shine of earned honor. He'd received it for actions during a supply convoy that had come under attack, for making decisions under fire that had saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers. At the time, the recognition had felt both overwhelming and inadequate. Overwhelming, because he'd never thought of himself as particularly brave. Inadequate, because courage seemed like too small a word for the complex mixture of fear, determination, and love for his fellow soldiers that had driven his actions. Luke closed the box and returned it to its place in his dresser drawer. He wouldn't need the medals for what was coming, but he needed to remember the man who had earned them. That soldier had understood something about standing up for what was right, about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, about the responsibility that came with having the strength to make a difference. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp air that made everything seem sharper and more vivid. Luke arrived at the sanctuary early to help Maisie with the morning feeding, but they both moved through their routine with distracted efficiency, their minds already focused on the afternoon's meeting. "Are you nervous?" Maisie asked as they finished with the horses. "Terrified," Luke admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "I've never been involved in anything like this before." "Me neither. But I keep thinking about my mother and all those families she helped quietly over the years. She never backed down from doing what she thought was right, even when it cost her everything." Luke nodded, understanding the weight of inherited responsibility and the desire to honor someone's memory through action rather than just words. "Your mother would be proud of what you're doing." "I hope so. But Luke, I want you to know that if this gets too complicated or dangerous, I'll understand if you need to step back. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect." Luke looked at her face, noting the mixture of determination and concern in her expression. Over the past 6 weeks, Maisie had become the center of his world in ways that he was still trying to understand. The thought of stepping back, of returning to his old life of careful isolation, felt like contemplating voluntary blindness after. Learning to see, "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "We're in this together." The community center was already busy when they arrived for the 2 o'clock meeting. Carmen Rodriguez had driven down from San Antonio with a box full of legal documents and copies of all her research. The Herrera family had come from 3 different cities, 2 brothers, a sister, and several adult children who had learned about their family's legal claim only days earlier. Luke was introduced to Miguel Herrera, a man in his 60s who worked as a high school principal in Austin, and his younger brother Carlos, who ran a construction company in Houston. Their sister Eleanor had driven in from Dallas with her 2 adult sons, both of whom were lawyers specializing in real estate law. "We want to thank you for bringing this situation to our attention," Miguel said, as they gathered around the large table in the center's main room. "Our family has always known that something wasn't right about the sale of our grandfather's land, but we never had the resources to investigate it properly." Carmen spread out the documents that proved the illegality of Morrison's land acquisition, walking the Herrera family through the legal framework that supported their claim. Elena's sons asked detailed questions about statutes of limitations and the process for challenging decades-old property transfers, but Carmen's research had anticipated most of their concerns. "The beautiful thing about this situation," Carmen explained, "is that Morrison has actually strengthened your case by making improvements to the property over the years. Under Texas law, those improvements become part of the land value that he'll have to compensate you for if he wants to keep the property. And if he can't afford to pay fair market value for 400 acres plus 30 years of improvements?" Carlos asked. "Then he loses the land," Carmen said simply, "which gives us significant leverage in negotiations about the boundary dispute with the sanctuary." As the meeting progressed, Luke found himself taking on an unexpected role as a bridge between the different parties. His knowledge of local politics and personalities helped the Herrera family understand the dynamics they were dealing with, while his military experience gave him insight into the strategic thinking that would be necessary to outmaneuver Morrison's aggressive tactics. "Morrison's not going to back down easily," Luke warned. "He's used to getting his way through intimidation and superior resources. When he realizes that strategy isn't going to work this time, he might escalate to more desperate measures." "What kind of desperate measures?" Elena asked. Luke thought about Morrison's reputation in the community, about the stories that circulated quietly about his methods for acquiring properties from struggling landowners. Harassment, probably. Maybe some form of economic pressure. If he has any business relationships with members of your family, possibly vandalism or other forms of intimidation. "Are you trying to scare us away from pursuing this?" Miguel asked, but his tone suggested curiosity rather than offense. "No," Luke said firmly. "I'm trying to make sure everyone understands what we might be facing so we can prepare for it properly." The conversation continued for another hour, with the group developing a detailed strategy for approaching Morrison with their evidence. They decided that the Herrera family's lawyers would file their own lawsuit challenging Morrison's ownership of the 400 acres, while simultaneously demanding that he drop his boundary dispute with the sanctuary. "The key is timing," Carmen explained. "We want to file both actions simultaneously so Morrison doesn't have time to develop a counter-strategy. If we can catch him off guard, we might be able to force a settlement before this turns into a prolonged legal battle." As the meeting broke up, Luke found himself shaking hands with people who'd been strangers 3 hours earlier, but who now felt like allies in a cause that mattered. Miguel Herrera clapped him on the shoulder with the firm grip of someone who recognized a fellow veteran. "Thank you for your service," Miguel said quietly, "both to our country and to our family." Luke nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that he associated with belonging to something larger than himself. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt like he was part of a team again, working toward a goal that required everyone's best efforts and mutual trust. That evening, Luke and Maisie sat on the porch of the sanctuary house, sharing a bottle of wine and talking through the day's events. The horses were settled in their stalls, the evening chores were done, and for the first time in weeks, Luke felt like they might actually have a chance of winning the fight they'd been forced into. "I've been thinking about something," Maisie said as they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. "When this is all over, when the sanctuary is secure and Morrison is no longer a threat, what happens next?" What do you mean? I mean, what happens between us? This whole situation has brought us together in ways that neither of us expected, but I don't want to assume that just because we work well together in a crisis, we'd work well together in normal circumstances. Luke considered her question, thinking about the man he'd been 6 weeks ago and the man he was becoming. The old Luke would have deflected the question, would have found a way to avoid examining his feelings too closely. But the new Luke, the one who was willing to fight for what mattered, couldn't hide from the truth of what he felt. "I love you," he said, the words coming out with surprising ease. "I didn't expect it, and I don't entirely understand it. But I love you more than I've ever loved anyone or anything in my life." Maisie turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the porch light and something deeper that might have been relief. "I love you too," she said. "I have for weeks now, but I wasn't sure if what we had was real or just the result of extraordinary circumstances." "It's real," Luke said, reaching for her hand and marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "At least it's real for me." "For me too," Maisie said, squeezing his fingers. "So what do we do about it?" Luke thought about his mother's letter, about her belief that he was made for gentleness and love, about the possibility that some risks were worth taking even when the outcome was uncertain. "We build something together," he said. "The sanctuary. Our lives, whatever comes next, we build it together." As they sat holding hands on the porch, surrounded by the quiet sounds of settling horses and night birds, Luke felt like he was finally becoming the person his mother had seen in him all those years ago. It had taken 3 decades and the love of a remarkable woman to get there, but he was finally ready to embrace the life he'd been too afraid to imagine. The town hall meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, and by 6:30 the community centre was already packed beyond its normal capacity. Word had spread quickly through Millfield about the legal challenge to Morrison's and property holdings, and it seemed like half the county had turned out to witness what promised to be the most dramatic public confrontation in recent memory. Luke stood near the back of the room with Maisie, both of them trying to project calm, confidence, while their hearts raced with nervous anticipation. Carmen Rodriguez sat at the front table with the Herrera family's lawyers, her research documents organized in neat stacks that represented months of meticulous investigation. Across the aisle, Morrison sat with his own legal team, his face bearing the expression of a man who was used to controlling every situation he entered. Sheriff Bradley called the meeting to order and explained the formal process for presenting evidence in a public forum. As the presiding official, he would moderate the discussion and ensure that both sides had equal opportunity to state their cases. The town council would serve as observers, though they had no official authority to make binding decisions about the property disputes. "The floor is open for initial statements," Bradley announced. "Mr. Morrison, as the party who filed the original lawsuit, you may present your case first." Morrison stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and confident. He was a big man who had spent 60 years learning how to dominate rooms through sheer physical presence, and he used that presence now to maximum effect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. "I've lived in this community for 45 years. I've employed hundreds of local people, supported local businesses, and contributed more tax revenue than any other single landowner in the county. I think I've earned the right to expect that my property rights will be respected." He gestured toward a large map that his lawyer had mounted on an easel, showing the disputed boundary between his ranch and the sanctuary. "This boundary dispute is not personal. It's about ensuring that property lines are accurately maintained according to legal surveys. The Quinn family has been occupying 15 acres of my land for decades, and I'm simply asking that the correct boundaries be recognized." Morrison's presentation was smooth and professional, backed by impressive visual aids, and delivered with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to get what he wanted. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, methodically building his case while projecting an image of reasoned authority. When Morrison finished, Sheriff Bradley turned to the other side of the room. "Ms. Quinn, you may now present your response." Maisie stood up, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Luke felt a surge of pride as he watched her face the crowd with quiet dignity, knowing that she was about to challenge one of the most powerful men in the county with nothing but truth and determination. "Thank you, Sheriff Bradley," Maisie said, her voice clear and strong. "Before I address Mr. Morrison's boundary claims, I think this community needs to know about some other property issues that have recently come to light." Luke saw Morrison's lawyer lean forward with sudden attention, apparently not expecting the discussion to move beyond the specific boundary dispute. Morrison himself remained impassive, but Luke caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maisie nodded to Carmen Rodriguez, who stood up and began distributing copies of documents to the town council members and Sheriff Bradley. "What you're receiving are copies of the original land grant documents for a 400-acre parcel that Mr. Morrison purchased in 1989. According to our research, that purchase was never legally valid." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as people processed the implications of what they were hearing. Morrison's face went red, and he started to stand up, but his lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm. Carmen took over the presentation, walking through the legal framework that proved the Herrera family's continuing ownership of the disputed land. Her explanation was clear and methodical, supported by documents that she passed around for examination. The sale of this property violated both Mexican and Texas law, Carmen concluded. Mr. Morrison has been illegally occupying 400 acres for 34 years, and the rightful owners are prepared to file suit to reclaim their property. "This is ridiculous," Morrison finally exploded, standing up despite his lawyer's attempts to keep him seated. "I bought that land in good faith. I have a deed." "You have a deed from someone who had no legal authority to sell the property," Carmen replied calmly. "The sale was invalid from the moment it occurred." Luke watched Morrison's face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. For the first time in the man's adult life, he was facing opposition that he couldn't intimidate or buy off. The carefully constructed empire he'd built through aggressive acquisition of struggling properties was suddenly vulnerable to challenge. "Furthermore," Maisie continued, "we believe that Mr. Morrison's current lawsuit against the sanctuary is motivated not by legitimate boundary concerns, but by his desire to acquire our property for his own expansion purposes. This pattern of using legal intimidation to force out smaller landowners ends today." The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Luke could see neighbors nodding in recognition, apparently connecting Morrison's current actions with other questionable land acquisitions over the years. The man who had dominated local politics through wealth and influence was suddenly facing public scrutiny of his methods. Morrison's lawyer whispered urgently in his client's ear, probably advising him to remain calm and avoid making statements that could be used against him later. But Morrison was too angry and too accustomed to getting his way to listen to careful counsel. "You people have no idea what you're dealing with," Morrison said, his voice rising to a shout. "I've built this county's economy. I've provided jobs and tax revenue that keep this community alive. And this is how you repay me? By listening to lies from outsiders who want to destroy everything I've worked to build." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Luke felt his own anger rising in response. For 34 years, he had watched powerful men use intimidation to get their way, had learned to keep his head down and avoid confrontation. But something fundamental had changed in him over the past 6 weeks, and he found himself standing up before he was fully conscious of the decision. "The only person trying to destroy anything here is you, Morrison," Luke said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. The silence that followed Luke's words stretched for what felt like an eternity, Every person in the room turned to look at him, many with expressions of surprise that quiet Luke Maddox had chosen this moment to find his voice. Morrison's face went from red to purple, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You have no right to speak to me that way," Morrison snarled. "You're nothing but a hermit who's never contributed anything to this community. What gives you the authority to judge my actions?" Luke felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had always accompanied confrontation, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a calm certainty that came from knowing he was fighting for something larger than himself. Around the room, he could see faces of people he'd known his entire life, neighbors who had always treated him with polite distance, but who were now listening to every word he said. "What gives me the right is that I've watched you bully people for years," Luke replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I've seen you force out families who couldn't afford to fight your lawyers. I've watched you turn this community into your personal kingdom, and I'm tired of pretending that's normal." Maisie reached for Luke's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of support that felt like an anchor in the storm of emotions swirling around the room. The simple touch reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore, that he had something worth protecting and someone who believed in him. "You want to talk about contribution to the community?" Luke continued, gaining confidence with each word. "Let's talk about Eleanor Quinn, who spent 20 years helping families in crisis without asking for recognition or repayment. Let's talk about the sanctuary that provides a safe place for animals that have nowhere else to go. That's the kind of contribution that actually matters." Morrison took a step forward, his size and obvious anger making several people in the front row lean back in their chairs. "You don't know what you're talking about, Maddox. You've spent your whole life hiding on that worthless piece of land, avoiding responsibility and human contact. Don't pretend you understand anything about leadership or community building." The words hit closer to home than Luke cared to admit. For most of his adult life, Morrison's assessment would have been accurate. Luke had hidden from the world, had chosen isolation over engagement, had convinced himself that safety lay in avoiding all risks that involved other people. But as he looked around the room, Luke realized that everything had changed. The scared, defensive man who had lived in fear of becoming like his father was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real strength came not from dominance, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right. "You're absolutely correct about who I used to be," Luke said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I did spend years hiding from the world, avoiding responsibility and human connection. But that changed when I met Maisie Quinn and learned what it means to be part of something larger than myself." He turned slightly to address the crowd rather than just Morrison, drawing strength from the faces of people he'd grown up with but had never really known. "I've learned that real leadership isn't about accumulating power or intimidating people into submission. It's about service, about protecting the vulnerable, about building something that makes the whole community stronger. Enough of this nonsense." Morrison shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "You people are making a serious mistake if you think you can challenge me. I have resources that you can't imagine, and I will use every one of them to protect what's mine." Sheriff Bradley stood up from his position at the moderator's table, his hand resting on his duty belt in a gesture that was both casual and clearly meaningful. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and return to your seat. This is a public forum, not a place for threats." But Morrison was beyond listening to reason. Years of getting his way through intimidation had convinced him that volume and aggression were always effective tools, and he couldn't adapt to a situation where those tactics were not only ineffective but actively damaging to his position. "Threats?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "These people are trying to steal my property based on century-old paperwork and fabricated legal theories. I'm the one being threatened here." Carmen Rodriguez stood up calmly, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to Morrison's emotional outburst. Mr. Morrison, the documents supporting the Herrera family's claim are a matter of public record. If you believe our research is incorrect, you're welcome to present contradicting evidence. I don't have to prove anything to you people, Morrison snapped. I've been paying taxes on that land for 34 years. I've made improvements worth millions of dollars. No court in Texas is going to take that away based on some technicality about Mexican land grants. Miguel Herrera stood up slowly, his dignity and calm serving as another contrast to Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior. Mr. Morrison, my family doesn't want to destroy your livelihood. We want justice for a wrong that has gone uncorrected. For too long, if you're willing to negotiate in good faith, we can find a solution that works for everyone. The only solution is for you people to drop this ridiculous claim and stop interfering with my legitimate business interests, Morrison replied. And if you won't do that voluntarily, I'll make sure you regret it. The threat was explicit enough that Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his expression serious. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to clarify what you mean by that statement. Morrison looked around the room, apparently realizing for the first time that his outburst had been witnessed by dozens of community members and recorded by the local newspaper reporter. His lawyer was frantically trying to get his attention, probably hoping to stop him from saying anything else that could be used against him in court. But Morrison's anger and pride wouldn't let him back down gracefully. I mean that I will use every legal resource at my disposal to protect my property rights and my reputation, and anyone who thinks they can intimidate me into submission is going to learn otherwise. Luke felt Maisie squeeze his hand, and when he looked at her face, he saw not fear, but resolve. They had exposed Morrison's illegal actions and challenged his authority in the most public way possible. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Then I guess we'll see you in court, Luke said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. For the first time in his adult life, Luke Maddox had chosen to fight rather than hide, and as he looked into Morrison's furious face, he felt nothing but calm certainty that he was finally on the right side of a battle that mattered. 6 months later, Luke stood in the workshop behind the sanctuary barn, carefully sanding the wooden sign that would mark the entrance to the newly expanded Quinn Maddox Horse Sanctuary. The letters were carved deep into the oak board, each one shaped by hand with the patience and precision that had become his signature approach to everything that mattered. Maisie had suggested the joint name, and Luke had found that seeing their names linked together in carved wood felt like a promise made tangible. The legal battles had concluded 3 months earlier with a settlement that surprised everyone except Germain Rodriguez, who had predicted from the beginning that Morrison's position was ultimately indefensible. Faced with irrefutable evidence of his illegal occupation of the Herrera family's land, Morrison had agreed to pay fair market value for the 400 acres, a sum that amounted to nearly $2 million when interest and improvements were factored into the calculation. The Herrera family had generously donated a significant portion of the settlement to the sanctuary, ensuring that Eleanor Quinn's dream would not only survive, but flourish for generations to come. The mortgage debt that had threatened the property was paid off completely, and there was enough money left over to fund operations for the next 5 years while Maisie built the donor network that would sustain the sanctuary's long-term mission. Morrison himself had quietly left Millfield 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, selling his remaining properties to a consortium of local farmers who were committed to keeping the land in agricultural use. The departure of the man who had dominated local politics for so long created space for new voices and new approaches to community leadership. Luke had been surprised when Sheriff Bradley approached him about running for a seat on the town council, but Maisie had encouraged him to consider it. "You've found your voice," she had said. "Maybe it's time to use it to help other people find theirs." The workshop door opened, and Maisie stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that still made Luke's chest tighten with gratitude for the unexpected gift of her love. She set the coffee down on his workbench and studied the nearly finished sign with the critical eye of someone who appreciated craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth curves of the carved letters. "Your grandfather would be proud of the work you're doing." Luke nodded, thinking about the coffee tin in his kitchen that still held his mother's ring and letter, but now also contained a photograph of him and Maisie taken on their wedding day 3 months earlier. The simple ceremony had been held in the sanctuary's main paddock, with the horses serving as witnesses and half the town in attendance to celebrate the union of 2 people who had found healing in each other's arms. "I've been thinking about something," Maisie said, settling onto a hay bale and watching Luke apply the final touches to the sign. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned that the Williams family is struggling again. Their youngest daughter needs surgery, and the insurance isn't covering all the costs." Luke paused in his sanding, understanding immediately what Maisie was suggesting. "How much do they need?" "About $3,000. I know we've already committed to helping the Rodriguez family with their roof repairs, and there's the Johnsons' situation with their medical bills, but I keep thinking about what my mother would do." Luke smiled, recognizing the echo of Eleanor Quinn's quiet generosity in her daughter's words. Over the past 6 months, he and Maisie had continued Eleanor's tradition of helping struggling families, but they had done it openly, creating a formal assistance fund that allowed the community to participate in supporting its most vulnerable members. "The fund can handle 3,000, Luke said, "and if it can't, we'll find a way to make it work." "Are you sure?" "I don't want to put financial pressure on the sanctuary just because I can't say no to people who need help." Luke set down his sandpaper and turned to face his wife, marveling as he did every day at the word wife and what it represented. "Maisie, this place exists because people couldn't say no to creatures who needed help. Your mother understood that healing happens in community, not in isolation. If we can help the Williams family, we should help them." Maisie nodded, her expression reflecting the same contentment that Luke felt when he considered how dramatically their lives had changed. The sanctuary now housed 8 horses, each one representing a story of rescue and recovery that paralleled their own journey from isolation to connection. Murphy, the skittish gelding who had arrived with trust issues, now served as a therapy. Horse for children with autism, his gentle patience apparently unlimited when it came to small humans who understood what it meant to feel different from everyone else. Stella had become the sanctuary's ambassador, greeting visitors with the dignity of an elder stateswoman who had earned her peaceful retirement. Rosie had blossomed under consistent care and now served as a companion horse for new arrivals who needed reassurance that safety was possible. "I got a call from the state veterinarian this morning," Maisie said. "There's a situation in East Texas where authorities seized 12 horses from a neglect case. They need temporary placement while the legal proceedings work their way through the courts." Luke considered the logistics of expanding their operation again. The new barn was nearly finished, and the additional pasture land they had purchased with part of the Herrera settlement could easily accommodate more animals. More importantly, they now had a network of volunteers and supporters who could help with the increased workload. "How soon do they need an answer?" "Next week. But Luke, taking on 12 horses at once would be a significant commitment. I want to make sure you're comfortable with that level of expansion." Luke thought about the man he'd been a year earlier, living alone on his ranch and convinced that safety lay in avoiding all complications that involved other people. That man would have been terrified by the prospect of taking responsibility for 12 additional lives. But the man he'd become understood that some responsibilities were privileges, that caring for others was not a burden, but a gift. "Let's do it," he said. "We have the space, we have the resources, and most importantly, we have each other." Maisie crossed the workshop and wrapped her arms around him, and Luke realized with wonder that the embrace which had once overwhelmed him with its unfamiliarity now felt like the most natural thing in the world. He had learned to trust in love, to believe in the possibility of healing, to understand that his mother had been right about his capacity for gentleness. As they stood holding each other in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials of their shared life, Luke could hear the horses moving peacefully in their stalls, content in the knowledge that they were safe and cared for. It was the sound of healing made audible, the proof that damaged hearts could learn to trust again when they found the right combination of patience, love, and time. The struggling cowboy who had never felt a hug had become a man who understood that the best things in life were built through the daily choice to remain open to connection, to continue believing in the possibility of love, and to keep creating space for others to find their own healing. In Maisie's arms, surrounded by the sanctuary they had built together, Luke finally understood what it meant to be home.